All right. Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today for the first webcast in our Microsoft Dynamics GP Education Series brought to you by Tribridge and msdynamicsworld.com. Today's session, Tips for Using Financial Workflows in Microsoft Dynamics GP 2015, will be presented by Toby Darby, who is a Senior Consultant at Tribridge. The webcast will last about 45 minutes, and at the end, you'll have an opportunity to ask Toby questions and share your point of view. If you have any questions for Toby, please type them into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. Today's session will also be recorded and posted online within the next few days. So without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Toby Darby.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I am here to present to you Workflow 2.0 for Microsoft Dynamics GP. So the first thing we're going to do is cover a little bit about who Tribridge is. We're going to walk through what's available to you in the financial workflows, some requirements that you need to set workflow up, why should you use workflow, look through a few samples, and then we'll have a demo of the product in GP. And then once we've wrapped those things up, we can go through your questions and comments. So a little bit about Tribridge. We are the largest Microsoft Dynamics customer base in North America. We've been Worldwide Partner of the Year 4 times over several years. We are the 2015 Microsoft Dynamics Partner of the Year, and we have over 600 team members who average 20 years of consulting and industry experience. We also are a top partner of Cornerstone On Demand, and we work very well with tested methodologies and strive hard to keep our perfect customer relations with our team members and our customers. Excuse me. For GP 2015 2.0 workflows, we're really centering around the financial area, and we'll poke in a little bit with the purchase requisitioning and approval process. There are other workflows available to you, some that have lived in Business Portal, Employee Self-Service, and PDK, things like project timesheet, project expenses. You've got some time and attendance. You've got direct deposit, employee profiles, W-4s, and employee skills and training. So those are additional features available to you in GP 2015. The GP 2013 R2 has the time and attendance, project timesheet, purchase order approval, and purchase requisition. We're going to start through the GL process. We'll review a few things on the payables batch and vendor approval, and then we'll take a look at GP. On the system requirements, what do you need in order to establish the workflow within GP? The very first thing you're going to need is a MAPI compliant email system. And really what that means is Exchange or Outlook or Office 365 or any compatible mail system that will allow you to email from within GP. If you're not sure if your system is MAPI compliant, you can open up a Word document in your system and do the send to. And if your email opens up, then that does mean you have a MAPI compliant email program. You also need to have a web server with IIS and ASP.NET. This will also require you to install web services, which can be installed from the GP Media. You need Internet Explorer 9.0 or later, and your users for the workflow need to be a domain user or an Active Directory user. So if they have a network login, they can be part of your workflow system. So why should you use workflow? One of the biggest pieces of workflow is the ability for you to kind of control what's being entered into the system, review processes, if you need to be compliant for SOX, or your auditors have directed you to really go through an approval process to make sure that people validate transactions validate the entry. And really, it's a good way to keep track of things that you're passing through your organization. So if you have expenses or purchase orders that need approval, rather than them sitting on somebody's desk and they get lost, it can go through the workflow process, and it will really help you keep a handle on where everything is. The workflow does allow you to see where the documents are during the process. So if they've been entered and submitted for approval, if they've been rejected, you'll see notes associated with that as well. So you do have a lot more visibility to what's going on. GP doesn't require, or the workflow doesn't require, that you have SharePoint, which is something that was used in the past. The SharePoint component of the workflow really made things a lot more complicated. The workflow piece in GP is a lot faster to set up, and it's easier to manage. Also, your GP workflow users do not have to log into GP to approve those flows. They just need to use their email functionality with the web services to do their approval process. So on the batch approval process, once you submit a batch for approval, it sits in the queue and flows to the responsible party for review and approval. In the past with GP, you can always set a secure password in the system to keep people from posting the batches. But again, if they knew the password or they have access to the setup of the general ledger, they can see the password and just enter it and move forward. With the workflow, you have to approve the batch before you can actually post the transactions. And I'm seeing that people are having some difficulties hearing me. I'm going to see if I can turn my microphone up a little bit here. I hope that's a little bit better. So when the general ledger batch goes through the posting process, you can still add transactions to the batch. You can even post the edit list and enter additional information during the process, even though it's still going through the pending process. The workflow piece itself is available in the batch entry window, in the series posting window, and also master posting. You will be able to view the history of this workflow for any of the steps in those windows, as well as the journal entry inquiry window. So one of the examples would be, let's say I wanted to establish a batch approval for anything that's over $10,000. I can set up my batch approval process, assign it to the person responsible, and also assign an email message that goes along with that workflow. So I've, in essence, set up a workflow process that's conditional based on the value of my batch. The user who has created the batch will then go into the batch entry window or the transaction itself and hit the submit button. And then it's going to allow you to view the history of the transaction when this button becomes available. Once the process has been submitted for review, the approver will get an email similar to this that states there's some transactions for them to review. They can approve directly from this window, from the email. They can also log into GP if they are a GP user and approve the batches as there as well. Once the approver has gone through the process, they're going to be able to see the batch status in the history, and also from the drop-down of the workflow, not only do you get this message here in this window, but you have a drop-down to review that will show you the status of the batch. So this says this workflow is pending approval by Joe. And once Joe has approved the batch, it will show the status that the batch has been approved. Once the batch has been approved, then you can actually post the general ledger transaction and move on to the next set of tasks. On the payable side, it's a similar process. So you do also have the ability to set up a batch approval for the payables transactions, which really requires that the batch be approved before the transactions are posted. Same with computer checks. The limit on the computer check side is you can't print the checks until the batch has been approved. Again, you can still enter additional transactions and print an edit list during that approval process. The approval windows are available from the batch entry window, the payables batch list, the pending approval, and the batch not submitted window. Excuse me. You also have the ability to set up a workflow for vendor approval. So if you have brand new vendors that you want to establish in GP, you can set up different tasks or approvals for your workflow based around the vendor. So basically what this means is you might have a vendor set up in the system, but it will basically show you that the vendor's transactions are on hold. You won't be able to post anything or cut checks until the vendor has been approved. That applies itself to the PO entry window and also from the payables transaction entry window. Receivables has the same type of functionality. Set up your workflow, batches need approval. You can then post the batch once it's been approved, but you can still enter transactions and print your edit list while the transactions themselves are in the approval process. I'm still getting people telling me my sound's fading in and out. All right, I'm actually going to go into GP and show you the setups, and we'll do a few transactions and look at the workflow so you can see how things function. So in GP, I have two different users. I have Paul, who is my approver, and then I have Aaron Barr, who would be a person who might enter a requisition or a payables batch. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I keep moving my microphone, but I'm still getting some messages that people can't hear me. When you are logged into GP, the only real setup process that you need would be to set up the email functionality within GP. So once you've established your web server that you're going to utilize, you've installed web services, you can come into GP and you can go through the workflow setup under the administration area, and you can establish your email settings. So you would put in your email address, your display name and your server, along with your authentication and your web services server. Once you've set that up, then you're going to go down to the company setup, and you're going to go to workflow, and you'll set up your email messages. Now, the system is pre-configured with some default emails, some message routing. You do have the opportunity to create your own custom email or change the approval emails in this window as well. So for instance, I pulled up my PO approval email. I can make changes to this email message, to the subject. I can also insert additional fields from both the document itself and from the workflow. So you have those automated substitutions that act like a mail merge when you're actually sending these out to the appropriate people. So if I was to insert some fields from the document on the purchase order side, I have several fields that I can pick from that pull from the purchase order tables. Same for workflow. I can click on the workflow button, and then I have fields from the workflow that I can insert into this email. So earlier we saw a slide that showed an email coming from GP related to a GL workflow batch. So this is a similar type of process. So once I have my messages set up, or I've changed some existing setups, I can also establish the workflow calendar. And what this is allowing you to do is establish your working days. So you're going to tell the system what is your start time for the day and what is your end time. Then you can also enter your non-working days and your holidays, and you can do this for multiple years that you have set up in GP. This is really going to allow the workflow to follow a time, like a time restraint. So I can set up my workflow to say, this particular workflow is required to be activated or approved in 8 hours. So I would have 8 full hours once the workflow has been submitted to approve. The system's going to take a look at the workflow to make sure if it's longer than 8 hours, maybe it's 3 days. But if I submitted something Friday morning, my workflow process wouldn't be due till Tuesday or Wednesday. I also have the ability to use delegates in the system. So for example, if I go to my user preferences, I can click on workflow delegation. So any users that might be a delegate for another person, and if they're on vacation, I can select that user and put in their workflows. Maybe an approver is going to be gone. I can establish Paul or Aaron as another user to approve their steps while the main approver is on vacation. So I can set up the information in here, and it will use the workflow steps and route to the appropriate person for review. When setting up your workflow maintenance, this is where you're going to establish the workflow process. The best step to take before you make it to this point is kind of map out what you want your workflow to do. Where are your approval processes? Where are your tasks? Maybe map it out a little bit before you come in here and start setting some things up. So within the workflow itself, I've got some financial options for my general ledger batch approval. I've got sales options for receivables. I have purchasing options, which controls my vendors, my purchase orders, and my purchase requisition. Then, of course, we've got payroll and project data available here as well. So I'm going to take a look at one of the processes that have already been set up, and then we'll set up one together. So if I look at purchase requisitioning, I have a default requisition workflow that's been established. Basically what this workflow does is it allows the requisition entry process to happen. When it's submitted, Paul has to review the selected vendor and make sure the vendor is correct. Once that task or step has been completed, then the requisition can be approved. So there's 2 different steps in this task. When I expand this, I can look at my different tasks and click on the first task, select vendor, and it gives me the overall setup for how I'm going to control this task. So this action is always required. The vendor has to be reviewed before it will move on to the approval step. Paul is responsible for approving the vendor, and he has 8 hours to do that once it's been submitted as a workflow. He will get a message stating that he has a vendor review, and he can review from his email, or he can log into GP and follow the tasks in the system. On the approved side of the requisition, my step here is the approval process. Actions always required for this step. The manager, or whoever has contributed this requisition, will be the person approving the step. They have 8 hours to approve the requisition or reject it before it's escalated. They will also receive an email, and this step follows the select vendor process. So that's a pretty simple workflow. You do have an opportunity to make things a little bit more complex and set up different types of conditional settings. So we'll take a look at setting one of those up. But I'm going to use that purchase requisition as an example to go through the workflow itself. So I'm going to log in as Aaron, and I'm going to enter a requisition. When I log into GP as Aaron's user, he has a list of requisitions that he has submitted, and you can see the different steps where these the statuses of these requisitions. So I have a few that are pending, a few that are completed, and then I have a requisition that has been recalled. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to enter a requisition, and I'm going to put in my notes. I don't typically know what vendor I'm going to order from. I just know that I need a processor. And the last time I bought one, it was $125. And I seem to, here we go, $125. And I lost my number key here. I can continue forward and put additional information, additional line items on here if I like. If I'm finished with my transaction, I can go ahead and submit this for approval, and it will go through the routing of the workflow for requisitioning. Now, once I've submitted that, an email does get sent to Paul. My email's not working properly here on this machine, but I can log into GP as Paul and I can see the status. Once I hit free display on Adam's homepage, you can see the status of the requisition that he created. It's been submitted to Paul. If I need to make some changes to this, I can go back into the requisition and I can recall this. I also have history where I can review what's happening. And basically it's telling me that the vendor needs to be selected first before anything else can happen on this workflow. So if I go back to Paul's user, and I go to my home page, I will have gotten an email which I can approve or reject the transaction from my email, or I can log into GP. I notice I have some tasks that are overdue. That's what this little warning message is, because I have 8 hours to approve these tasks, and the Fabricam company is kind of out of date, or maybe ahead of date. But I see all the requisitions. So I've got one requisition that needs approval, and I have a few requisitions that have some tasks associated with them. If I click on the one that Aaron has just submitted, I can see that this task is telling me I need to select the vendor. So there is no vendor associated with this transaction. So I can go ahead and select the vendor that we're going to purchase this server from, and I can save this transaction. If I click my workflow drop-down, I can tell the system that this task has been completed. I can delegate it to another user, or I can recall this transaction. I'm going to go ahead and complete this task, and then it will save my requisition for me. So once I've completed the task, then it's routed off to the next person for the approval process, which also happens to be Paul. So now I can see requisition 20. It says approval is needed. So if I log back in as Aaron and I look at my information for requisition 20, I can see that it's been submitted, but it still has a pending user action. So I can open that up and I can take a look at the status. Now it says the requisition just needs approval. So Paul went ahead and selected the vendor. I can see that here. I can also look at the view history and see additional information. So it's going to show me the workflow. Here's where I submitted it. Here's where Paul has selected the vendor. And here's where he completed the task. And now it's just waiting for the approval process. So I can go back to Paul's user, and I can go through that requisition, and I can further approve it, or I can even reject this if I need to do so. I'm going to choose to reject this. And then Aaron can actually see the rejected status on his GP system. Now, based on how you set up the workflow, I'm going to actually go into the workflow settings. You have the ability to set up notifications on every step of a workflow transaction. So my submission, my approval process, my rejection process, all of these have the ability to send notifications. So in the main screen, when I'm setting up a workflow, there's this box here to send notifications for completed actions. When I click on this little blue arrow, I have the ability to send emails on all of these types of transactions. So if I submit it, here's the email that goes to the appropriate resource. If I approve it, reject it, even if I want to do final approval. So I could send emails on all of these different stages. So let's say I wanted to set up a brand new workflow. I want to do something on vendor approval. I want to be able to have a user review any of my 1099 vendors to make sure that we have the appropriate federal identification number before they are added to GP and I start entering transactions. So I can go to my vendor approval and choose new workflow. I can give it a name. And also a description. I can have multiple steps associated with this. I can also send multiple emails based on what I'm doing. I'm going to go ahead and send notifications on the submission of my vendor and also the approval. Now this will default in a workflow email. I do have the ability to change that. Again, I can choose to set up a brand new one, or I can use the default email message that's already set up in the system. So basically this says, you've got a document that has been completed or submitted, and here's what needs to be done. And I'll do final approval. I can allow an approver to delegate the task. So if somebody's going to be out and they can't approve, I can send that to another user. I can allow the originator to be an approver if I like. I can always require at least one approval process. I can have more than one approver if I need to, or I can also do an alternate approver. These are going to be using your Active Directory users. So if I went to search for a user, I can search on people and groups. I can search and set some hierarchies. So I can use my direct manager. I can skip a manager. I can have multiple levels. I also can use a workflow role. So I can establish the originator, a workflow manager, and a final approval when I am selecting who I want to be in this hierarchy for the approval process. I'm going to choose Paul as my vendor 1099 reviewer. I'm going to add him to my list and choose OK. So he is my alternate final approval during this work process. When the task is overdue, I have the ability to escalate this, or I can escalate it to somebody specific, or I can automatically reject it if my task is overdue. Once I save this, then I can set some additional steps or set some conditions. So for example, I can choose my new step, and I can call this vendor 1099 settings. Could be pretty much anything you want to call it. Now I can either set this as an approval process or a task. So I could say, set this task and I want this task to be completed based on some conditional settings that I'm going to select. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to select where my vendor type, or my 1099 type, actually, which is in my setting here that I must have missed it. And I'm going to set it is not equal to 1099 vendor, and I'm going to add that. So any new vendors that are established that would be a miscellaneous dividend or interest type is going to end up going through this workflow. It's going to require the person that's responsible for this process or this task to go validate that the user or the vendor has a correct federal ID number before this vendor can be utilized within GP. I can assign it to a specific person, or I can assign it to a group or a hierarchy. Again, I'll just assign it to Paul, since I know he's in my Active Directory. And I want him to get a message. Again, I can use the predefined message, or I can establish a custom message myself. I only need one response. If I have multiple approvers in this process, I can set to majority, or that all the approvers need to take action on this task. So now I have a vendor process that has a multiple step. So once I add a vendor, and the vendor is not is a 1099 vendor, then it will go through that workflow process. That's pretty much how you establish your workflow. You get your setup completed, set up your calendar, establish the emails that you'd like to utilize, and kind of map out what types of workflows you're looking for. You're really processing documents, master records, or batch flows through the system. Keep that in mind. If you're just working on the financial side, again, you've got payroll pieces and project pieces as well. But the main difference between Workflow 2.0 and prior versions of Workflow, it's just a lot easier to manage and a lot easier to test, with the fact that you're not using SharePoint as in prior versions of the workflow process. You can have a simple hierarchy, you can have a complex hierarchy with multiple conditions. You can pretty much set up something really complicated and have the workflow, processed to the department heads, to the managers, and so forth and so on. They can be very simplistic or very complex. It's just a matter of what's going to fit your business process. So those are basically the workflow setups. We've got a couple examples on the slide deck. And if you've got any questions, I'd be happy to answer those. If you're asking some technical questions about web services and maybe some email settings, I might have to take those as a takeaway. But we'll see what we can do to answer your questions.
Great, thanks, Toby. So we do actually have a bunch of questions. All right, let me get them up here. Okay, so we have a question. We have multiple companies. Are there any features or tools available to assist with setting up the same workflow in different companies?
At the moment, there doesn't look to be an import-export tool, but I know that they are making changes on a regular basis. So we can work with Microsoft to see that level, see if they're ready for doing the import and export through to allow you to set it up on multiple companies.
Another question just came in. For GL approval, is it possible to have the invoice images attached to the workflow, i.e. from the batch click on an icon that takes you to the invoice?
At this step in the process, the imaging is not available for the transactions itself. There might be something that we can do with the web services to allow that. I'd have to look at that a little bit further.
Okay, here's another one. Are you able to set a rule that a batch requires approval if an individual entry is greater than an amount instead of the batch total?
I think there are some conditions that you can do that. If I look a little bit farther on, are they just looking general ledger or are they looking for payables batches?
Doesn't specify.
Okay. There are some instances where you can go down to the document level. I'll take a look to see if it's just the transaction level from receivables and payables or if it can be applied to the GL.
Okay. Okay, another question. Does workflow come standard with GP 2015 or is there an additional cost?
No, it does come standard with GP 2015. It also comes standard with GP 2013 R2. But again, there's different features in each version.
Okay. Somebody asked if this works with Google.
If they can send, like I mentioned, if you open a Word document and you use the send to, if your Google Mail processes, then you should be able to use the workflow in GP with Google Mail.
Okay. On the GL batch approval, can the approver post from the email?
There's no posting function from the email. I think we could build something into web services to do that. But typically that's a GP user function to post the batch.
Here's another question that just came in. To use the AP batch approval workflow, we'd want to attach invoice backup for managers, non-GP users to review. Is that possible?
So that was something another user had questions on. I'm not sure that the document attachment is available through the workflow. I think it can be done with web services, but we'll have to investigate that a little further.
Okay. Is workflow an option for GP 2013?
It is if you are on R2. Otherwise, you have to use, sorry, I was going to say, otherwise you'd have to use the SharePoint version of GP and workflow.
Another question came in. What workflows are available for project?
So for project, you've got project timesheet approval and project expense approval.
Could you talk about the difference between a task and approval?
So a task would be the example that I used with selecting the vendor before the document can be approved. So I could set up a task to say, review item ABC for this particular vendor to check for the unit of measure. So that would be a task rather than this document needs to be approved, yes or no.
Okay. Here's another question. What capabilities exist to attach source documents to batches, and what does an approver have to do to review the docs?
So just out of the box, the approver, if they have GP access, would actually need to go look at the transactions within GP. Again, I think there might be some capabilities with web services to do some document attachment, but we'd have to take a look at that. Just out of the box, that workflow doesn't offer that attachment process.
Another question, does this work with payroll module in HR?
So on the payroll HR, you have an employee self-service function to allow you to have your employees review their information, update their W-4s, review and update their direct deposit. Also skills and training, so they can go through a review process. Department heads or managers can review what skills the employee has, what training may be expired that needs to be re-updated. And then there's time and attendance entry. So users can enter their time to be processed through payroll.
Is workflow available for inventory item entry?
Not for inventory item entry. It is available on a purchase order or a purchase requisition where you can set some conditional settings based on an item, but it's not specific around inventory itself yet.
Is workflow available for web version only?
No, it is available under the desktop client and the web client.
Can you set a journal entry approval requirement regardless of dollar amount?
Absolutely.
Another question here. Who may create purchase requisition and who will check its reasonableness?
So that would be where I would sit down and do some planning on setting up a workflow. The users who would enter requisitions, they would have to have the capability to enter a requisition into the system. So I logged in as Aaron, and I could do a requisition. So anyone that has access to the requisition entry window, your workflow would be set up based on how you want that approved. Is it going to be that person's manager? Is it going to be the department head? Is it going to be based on the items the particular people are requiring? So you just need to sit down and plan what you want that approval process to look like.
Can you put creating a new GL account into a workflow?
The GL account is one of the master records that's not available for workflow yet.
Are there any mobile options?
So with GP, you do have an opportunity to log in the system based on currently how you do today. So if I log in through terminal server, or if I use my iPhone or my iPad to log into my RDP session or my Citrix session, or even the web client. So if you can reach GP now, you can use that workflow functionality through those apps. I think there are some apps coming out for workflow, but I haven't researched those yet.
Another question here. Any reason why the status bar will just say pending for approval by without a name?
Mainly because my setup isn't complete. So I didn't assign a delegator to all of my tasks, but that would be something that you would typically do. You would set up an approver or a delegator, and they would be established so that you will see the name and not a blank.
Is there a way to export workflow setup for project timesheet approval at GP 2015 upgrade test and import that after the cutoff live?
I would say there is probably a way to do that with the table settings. I would coordinate with the person or the team that's doing your upgrade so they can test that out. There's a set of workflow tables that could be exported out and in essence, do a restore if we need to do that.
Is there a drill down function if the approver is questioning a purchase?
There are some drill down in the email, but you're kind of limited to what's available in the email itself. Again, there's a lot of fields that you can add to the email message, so you put as much information in there as possible. If they need further details like a snapshot or an attachment, they would either have to access GP or look at the document itself.
Can Workflow work with Kronos Timekeeper in processing payroll?
That would probably be, I would say we'd have to do a little bit of discussion with Kronos on that. The workflow mainly works around the timesheet window, so the Kronos timesheets would have to be imported into the time and attendance function, but I think it can be done.
Are there any limits to the email body, or can you add as many fields as required?
You can add as many fields as you need, so you can write a book if you need to on your email message.
Can a batch be edited after it's been approved, and will it have to be reapproved?
Once the status has been completed, the batch process, the workflow itself is done. So if you do need to add stuff to it, you can do that and send it back through the approval process. It doesn't have to be reapproved, but it can be. It's just based on the workflow that you design.
Do you have to have Exchange in order to use Workflow?
No, you just need a MAPI compliant email system.
And how many steps can you have in a workflow?
You can have an unlimited amount of steps in a workflow.
I have another question regarding batch. Will it automatically send the batch back for approval?
If it's been edited, I think if you set up your workflow to do that, I do believe it can. There's a flag in the process once it's been edited where it can go through a notification process again.
Yeah, these are really great questions, everyone. Thanks so much. Keep them coming. Toby will be glad to answer them. Looks like we just have another one come in as well. Can you have more than one active workflow for a workflow type? If not, why not?
At this point, you can only have one active workflow for each type. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, but I certainly can find out why that is a limitation.
Okay, let's see if anybody has any more questions. All right, here's another one. Can you use the vendor approval for only a certain class of vendor? Some of our vendors are fed into the card or feed into the card from another flow.
Yes, you can. That can be one of the conditions that you set up for your workflow, that you would pick a specific class and you can make it equal to that class ID.
Are there reports that can be pulled to for auditing?
There are some workflow reports. They're limited right at the moment. I know that there are some in development. Mostly what you'd use would be maybe some SmartList or some Excel refreshable reports or SQL reports to help you with those reporting tools.
How would you fast track a bunch of PM approvals if they fall under a predetermined dollar amount?
So if you have a workflow set up and you've got, if you've established different dollar amount ranges, so you could have maybe one approver approve up to any transactions over $500, and maybe the next person has a limit of 10,000 or so forth and so on. If you know you want fast approval for anything under $500, you could have it go to one person and have it approved, or not go through the workflow at all. You just need to establish what you want that threshold to be. If you want one approver, if you want multiple approvers, and if there's different steps based on how much that approver can approve.
Does a workflow manager have access to all workflows or only the one he is manager of?
So the workflow access is based on security roles. So if I'm a user, a power user, I have access to all the workflows. I do believe right now there's no restriction on if I'm in the workflow setup, I have access to all the workflows, not just my area. I don't know if I really answered that question, if it was based on the setup or if it was based on the actual workflow itself.
Yeah, it didn't specify. Can an AP user void a historical PM transaction, that was previously approved and posted?
Yes.
Is it better from a workflow features standpoint to upgrade to GP 2015 rather than GP 2013 R2?
If you would like to upgrade to 2015, I do suggest that you do that. You've got more features. Plus you have some other bells and whistles in there that's not in GP 2013 R2.
Would a payables batch be available to view as a pending invoice in transactions by vendor while it's pending approval?
Yes, it would be.
What are the benefits to having multiple WF managers?
If you have dollar restrictions based on manager levels, or you needed to have more than one person approve workflow, that would be one place where multiple managers would be sufficient. Or maybe one user's on vacation, or one manager is out of the country and can't get emails. It really gives you some flexibility on the approval process.
Are you able to change or maintain workflow if there are documents currently in progress?
You can make some changes. The original workflow does have to be completed. So for instance, if I was going to delete a workflow, the document that's gone through the process, or the batch, does have to complete the process even though you are deleting a workflow.
And can you have multiple payable batches waiting for workflow approval?
Yes.
Okay. What workflow table in SQL shows approved documents?
I don't have that information in front of me, but I certainly can share that after this meeting.
These are great questions. Yeah, let's see if any more come in. Any reason why GP 2013 R2 does not have general GL workflow?
That was a feature that they just weren't able to get into that rollout, and they saved it for the 2015 release.
A couple more questions just came in as well. A workflow for intercompany transactions. How do you handle that?
I am not familiar with the workflow piece for intercompany. I believe if you have the batch established in the intercompany destination, you can trigger the workflow there, but it has to be set up on both sides. I'll get some additional information regarding that workflow.
Question just came in. Do you know if we can upgrade from GP 2010 directly to GP 2015, or do we need to go through GP 2013?
I do believe there is a direct upgrade from 2010 to 2015. I think you have to be on a certain service pack to do that, but you can go straight to 2015.
Another question here. I need to have the ability to approve payroll EFT batches and confirm the net equals the payroll calculation report. Is this something that could be set up?
So you could set up some web services to allow you to generate the report to help you do some comparisons. It's not an out-of-the-box function, but it's certainly something that can be designed.
See if any more questions come in. All right, it looks like that's all the questions for now. Oh, actually, here's one more that just came in. Can web services be installed on the same server as your GP instances?
It can be. I don't know that I would recommend that because typically the web services runs with a server that has IIS on it, and it's usually best to segregate the GP client from what you're doing with IIS. But that's really more of a preference in your IT team, or we can certainly work with you on recommendations.
So is it better to just have it on a SQL server then?
I wouldn't put it on a SQL server. I'd put it on a web server.
Okay, somebody has a question. Can a workflow perform an action? Example, if a particular user creates a requisition, can the requisition close automatically after so many days?
So one of the settings within a workflow is to close or reject the requisition or the workflow. So it's not really closing it, it's rejecting it if it hasn't gone through the approval process.
Can the approver use Microsoft Link to approve PM transactions?
So really we're looking for email functionality. I don't know where Link would come into play in this environment, but I can find some more information on that.
Okay, it looks like that is the end of the questions for now. We don't have any more coming in. I want to thank everybody for attending the session. I hope this was informative. Toby, I really want to thank you for joining us and giving a great presentation. If anybody has any follow-up questions, Toby, do you want to give them your email so they can contact you directly?
Certainly. My email is toby.darby@tribridge.com, and I would be happy to answer your questions.
Perfect. Well, thanks, everybody. Thanks again, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you so much.
Yep. Bye-bye.